Today marks exactly 30 years since the last prisoner left Robben Island. Nelson Mandela and dozens of other liberation icons spent long periods of time at that prison. To reflect on the island's history, I'm joined now by former prisoner, Professor Sats Cooper. He's now with the Pan-African Psychology Union. Prof, a very good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for your time. So you had left, of course, incarceration just years before the release of the final inmates from Robben Island. Did you ever think that all your comrades would eventually be released?
Yes, I think that, even though we didn't have news on a daily basis, we managed to get smuggled information, and it was quite clear that the struggle that was hotting up would result in our release. I expected that I would see my release through and continue in that struggle, which I did. And sure enough, within a few years thereafter, the last prisoners were released.
And you were released, if the internet is correct, in December of 1982. Can we go back to that period for a moment and talk about the conditions at the prison, especially for those of you who were young student activists at the time?
Well, look, the prison that we got into was a prison that was fairly regimented, and the prison had, and its authorities had to accommodate to us because we were young. They built walls literally around us to preclude us from infecting the older prisoners, which in the result they failed to do because there was communication. There was an eagerness from those older prisoners to find out exactly what was going on. And as you can imagine, being youthful activists, many students and budding intellectuals, we were all founts of information for them. So the prison atmosphere changed remarkably. The youthfulness was restored to that prison, and I think we gave a lease of life to prisoners who were fading and who thought the only option was the Bantustans and probably going back to some barren place in the country. Instead, the ebullience and the spirit of victory continued, and those prisoners who came after us took it to new levels. And that's why Robben Island in particular remains a place that is looked to by people here and abroad. It is a national heritage. Besides incarcerating 3 presidents in our democracy, it is a place that tourists go to in large numbers, and hopefully more will as the COVID restrictions decline.
And we talk a lot about the horrors that were endured by many of your fellow comrades at the various prisons around the country. I'm wondering how much of that you may have possibly witnessed or even had to endure on Robben Island specifically. Was there a lot of that going on?
Oh, yes. Look, you need to understand that it was the period where essentially outside, from 76 onwards, there was a literal struggle going on in most of the countries, and particularly the so-called townships, where young people were on the front lines, and on the other, there were young conscripts who were in the police, in the prisons, or in the military, white on one side and black on the other. And those front lines were experienced, and therefore inside prison, we were looked at as a serious danger, and we were guarded. As I said, walls were literally built around us to preclude us from engaging with everybody else. But police dogs were set on us. There were, notorious incidents where my comrades were locked up in different isolation blocks. In one instance, they were locked up and tear gassed while in the single cells, and Baton charged, all sorts of horrors. But because we were enabled by the spirit of freeing our minds and freeing ourselves, we didn't allow any of those to cause us despair and hopelessness. Indeed, for every blow that they gave, we retaliated within the confines of what we could. And as a result, Robben Island is celebrated as that site of struggle, renewal, and spirit, which never die.
And Prof, how did you keep that resolve, that strength of mind going, given the horrors that you were not only witnessing but also experiencing, especially when you were young men locked up essentially at your prime?
Well, look, in the worst moments, we realized that they, the oppressor, the apartheid technocrats, and those who would want to continue to thrust us into submission, were more afraid of what we stood for, were terrified of the realization of our ideals coming true than we were of them. And one of the biggest fears that they always had in the transition period was, will they, us, not do to them what they did to us? And of course, we saw the results of the settlement of 93, 94, and we did not turn on them. We did not have that kind of bloodletting that one would have expected. Indeed, I think that spirit of reconciliation allowed us to let our guard down, such that now we get people challenging the legitimacy of the struggle, forgetting that apartheid was a crime against humanity and still continues. Our minds, you see, Tembekile, were steeled against anything that they could do, because if they captured our minds, then we were lost, and we refused to do so.
And you make a good point there about how apartheid has ended. Yes, officially and on paper it's over, but many parts of South Africa, if not the country as a whole, are still quite racist. How do you reflect on that all these years later?
Well, we did not deal with the elephant in the room. The one coin, racism; on the flip side, sexism. That's what we confront, and we need to deal with it. We fail to do so, and that's why under the pandemic now, social media is replete with all sorts of accusations, counter-accusations. We have not dealt with racism. We don't deal with it in our education system. It's as if it didn't exist. So a lot of young people growing up, students in particular, in schools and in universities, have no understanding of that period. And the result is we get advantage taken. And when people see that, they resort to the worst, like the kinds of retorts we get when political sloganeering happens. And excess is justified. Corruption gets justified in the name of they did it, so what we do is minimal compared to what they did. Wrong is wrong.
On corruption, Prof, let me ask you very quickly, because we have been talking about that a lot this week, whether you look at the ANC step-aside debate that's currently going on. The deadline was meant to be today. We had the President appearing at the State Capture Commission in his capacity as leader of the ANC to answer questions of that nature. How much do you think, then, that the corruption and much of the malfeasance that has characterized the past 2 decades has soiled, in a way, the hard work that many of you put in, the sacrifices of your time?
Indelibly, it has cast a mark against what all of us collectively contributed to. I don't know how we can recover from that, except by bold, willing and able leadership standing up to be counted. That moral compass for which we stood and still stand needs to be restored, and all around us there are people, black and white, urban and rural, rich and poor, who want to see a restoration of that glorious image of a democratic South Africa that's much vaunted in our constitution, but all around us is tattered. As long as we have the kinds of gaps that we have, and people on high tread roughshod over the majority of our people we will continue to be soiled. That struggle, hopefully, will not be in vain. And we need to get back to simple accountability. I cannot account for my misconduct by naming you, Tembekile, because you did it, I can do it, and so on. We need, as we did with our democracy, to set a moral high ground, and we can. We can make this country safe for democracy. We can make it safe for our future, our children.
Professor Sats Cooper, good to speak to you from Durban this afternoon. Still to come.